Intelligence is not a compass. It's a performance-enhancing drug. And as such, it doesn't care what kind of competition you're competing in. Last edition, I told you about my foray into hacking and fraud on AOL at age 11. What I didn't get into was how that same mindset would be the undercurrent in the rhythm punctuating the next 25 years of chaos. If you read it, you know the story. What I didn't give you was the layer underneath the story. The memoir format doesn't have room for it. It warrants a scene, not scaffolding. But the scaffolding is actually where profundity lives. Because what was happening in that basement while I thought I was just running a scam was something structural. A structure that would pollute my existence for many years, until I tore it down with force and replaced it with grace. There's a great difference between intermediate expertise and mastery. One is often consumed by ego, narcissism, and hubris, feeling justified to go around imposing its will on others. The latter doesn't have anything to prove and knows you're likely to go on believing whatever it is you want to believe, regardless of what you are told. That's because the person who's just pretty good at a lot of things is unaware of their own underlying architecture. They conflate surface wins with something that carries breadth and depth. Fluid intelligence is enough to fuel you as you navigate and traverse your pathway, but simultaneously you're also building an invisible architecture. And if you remain unaware of it, your mind is being colonized by ghosts. Worse yet, you fail to realize that eventually your mind is no longer being colonized by ghosts. You are one. The type you already know. There's a person you've encountered, or you may have been this person. Hell, you might be this very person right now, preparing to do some mental gymnastics to distance yourself as soon as things hit too close to home. They're clearly brilliant. The pattern recognition is unsettling. They've already mapped 3 failure modes in a plan before you finished your first sentence. In a room, they're tracking variables most people aren't even aware exist. They find angles that aren't supposed to be there. They solve things in a day or two that stumped people with better credentials and decades of formal preparation. You watch them work and you think, this person could do anything. But on an almost clock-like recurrence, they're burning down everything they've built. Or, at the absolute minimum, every time you turn around, their foot is securely lodged in their mouth. Maybe it's substances. Maybe it's relationships that follow the strict definition of insanity. The intensity, the peak, the implosion, the scorched earth, time after time, hoping for different results. Maybe it's the career that keeps arriving at the threshold of real success only to be cut short by a sudden, inexplicable desire to commit hara-kiri, often in the most spectacular way possible, usually in the days and weeks just before the payoff would have arrived. Perhaps it's just that nothing ever quite lasts. The brilliance is real, but they seem to have shovels for feet. Progress is constantly competing with the holes they dig for themselves. The conventional explanation for this person is gifted but self-destructive. Chalk it up to the usual suspects: trauma, mental health, impulse control. The obvious variables get cited. The textbook prescriptive advice gets churned out. Everyone nods, and we move on. Those explanations probably aren't wrong. They're just operating at the wrong altitude. What's actually happening is structural. Being aware of it requires knowledge of self and constant reflection in near real time. Pausing after a blow-up to ask yourself why you just did that, what happened to front-load it, and why you weren't able to hit the brakes before all hell rained down upon those perceived to have slighted you. Here's what nobody told any of us when we were 11 years old, cracked open, talented, and completely unsupervised. The thing you're doing right now isn't just the thing you're doing. You're voting. You're casting ballots in an election that'll determine how your brain processes reality for the next several decades. And the polls close before you're old enough to understand what you're voting for. Cognitive architecture and the river that doesn't negotiate. Psychology's best map for this comes from Raymond Cattell. He split intelligence into 2 modes. Fluid intelligence, GF, is raw processing power. It's pattern recognition, novel problem solving, and the ability to navigate a system you've never seen before. It typically peaks early, late teens to mid-20s, depending on which study you read, before beginning a gradual, lifelong decline. Crystallized Intelligence, GC, is accumulated knowledge. It's the vocabulary, the formulas, the experience. This keeps growing until you die. Here's the critical nuance Cattell's model implies that rarely gets stated plainly. Fluid intelligence generally peaks in your late teens to mid-20s, and then it starts a slow, inevitable decline. The raw processing power is supposed to get replaced by the crystallized architecture of accumulated experience. The transition period between the two, we'll call that the valley. It's the span of years when fluid intelligence is running at full, blinding wattage, but crystallized wisdom hasn't yet arrived in sufficient quantities to keep you from touching the stove. And in that valley, something critical is being built that most people never examine because they're too busy marveling at their own reflection: your cognitive architecture. I don't mean this metaphorically. This is the actual structural configuration of how your brain processes information. Which neural pathways are getting heavily myelinated through repetition, which heuristics are cementing into automatic responses, which pattern recognition filters are running silently in the background, shaping every decision you incorrectly assume you're making by free will, which neural pathways are getting heavily myelinated through repetition, which heuristics are cementing into automatic responses, which pattern recognition filters are running silently in the background, shaping every decision you incorrectly assume you're making by free will. It's the operating system underneath the applications. Most people spend their entire lives clicking the shiny icons without ever once opening the terminal. Here's the mechanism. Wolfram Schultz spent years mapping what dopamine actually does, and the answer is weirder and vastly more important than the pop science summary. Dopamine doesn't just fire when you get a reward. It fires in response to predicted rewards. The system builds models. It learns to anticipate. When a prediction resolves, when the pattern closes exactly how your brain expected it to, the hit is significant. This is why a chess grandmaster gets a genuine physical rush from seeing a combination 3 moves out in a configuration a novice can't even parse. The architecture has been trained to produce a reward signal for a very specific type of cognitive activity. The activity itself starts to feel good, not because of external validation, but because the brain was trained to generate a hit at the exact moment of resolution. Now, here's the part they leave out of the self-help books. Your brain doesn't give a solitary fuck what the pattern matching was pointed at. It rewards the resolution. It doesn't care about the ethics of that resolution. It doesn't care about the downstream collateral damage. It certainly doesn't care if what just happened was actually good for you. The match, the click, that deeply satisfying moment when the chaotic variables collapse into an elegant answer, which means if you spent your formative years using fluid intelligence in a specific direction, say finding exploits, running angles, navigating the topological maps of other people's vulnerabilities for personal gain, you didn't just pick up some neat hacker skills. You built a cognitive architecture that generates a specific potent reward signal whenever that type of thinking occurs. And guess what? That signal doesn't vanish just because the behavior becomes illegal. It doesn't fade when it starts costing you more than it yields. It escalates, because escalation is exactly what variable ratio reinforcement schedules do. If you know anything about B.F. Skinner's work on intermittent reinforcement, you know this is the exact same mechanism that makes slot machines impossible to walk away from. The uncertainty of the hit makes the hit more potent, not less. I call what gets built in that valley reward loop architecture. These are cognitive structures that form not around what is true or useful or inherently good, but around what has historically produced the signal. It's an architecture that doesn't ask what's right, but rather the older, louder, more chemically urgent question: what worked before? And what worked before is an incredibly narrow, dangerous optimization target when you're 11 years old. You haven't run the models long enough to see the tail risk. You felt the hit, you just haven't seen the invoice running the concept on the actual story. Let me walk this concept through the basement because I think that's where it becomes visible in a way abstractions can't quite reach. The kid at the Packard Bell that night was running fluid intelligence at maximum RPM. The hyperplane was active, that internal space where I could visually enumerate quadrants of possibility space using pattern matching and contextual layers to collapse otherwise infinite option sets into something ruthlessly actionable. HTML decoded on first exposure in under 2 hours. Social engineering architecture constructed entirely on instinct. Logistical gaps identified like CGI routing and solved within hours by sniffing out the right domain expert VG and getting him on board. Every one of those moves was pattern recognition operating on novel information with zero prior knowledge base. Textbook fluid intelligence. If you'd watched it from the outside, you'd have been thoroughly impressed. Now watch what else was happening beneath the floorboards. Every time a pattern resolved, a reward signal fired. The insta-kiss code rendering perfectly on 8OP. The hijack form submitting correctly to VB.net. The inbox populating with the first batch of stolen credit cards. Each of those moments produced a massive dopamine event, not because the accomplishment was noble, but because the cognitive prediction was confirmed. The loop closed, the architecture received another vote. By the time that inbox rendered in thirds over a 56K connection, yielding several hundred CCs from a single run, the architecture had received roughly 15 significant reward events inside a 48-hour window. Every single one was logged for the same basic cognitive motion: find an exploit, route around the obstacle, confirm the extraction, not build something. Extract something. That is a fundamentally different architecture than it appears to be. Building and taking can look absolutely identical from the outside, the same lateral problem solving, the same speed, the same dark elegance, but they produce diametrically opposed cognitive infrastructure. Building, when it works, generates a reward for creation and sustainment, for watching something compound past its initial state into an entity you couldn't have predicted at the starting line. Taking, when it works, generates a reward strictly for the moment of successful extraction, for the peak of the hit right before the downstream costs inevitably arrive. The architecture becomes calibrated to the spike, not the slope. Build that specific architecture at 11 years old and you have no idea what you've just done. You just know that your brain operates exceedingly well in a particular direction. The world confirms it. The intermittent nature of the confirmation, sometimes it works spectacularly, sometimes you brick it, but the successes are staggering enough that you keep running the algorithm. Makes the architecture more durable, not less. Skinner's variable ratio schedule, the slot machine. It's the exact same machinery. Then you spend the next 25 years living inside it. Every relationship, every business, every side project is filtered through an operating system that was meticulously calibrated for extraction, wired to feel most alive at the absolute moment of the hit, long before the invoice arrives. And the invoice always arrives. The last line of that story was, "Maybe I earned it." What I didn't tell you was that I didn't even know I'd placed the bet. Reward loop archaeology, a self-audit. Time to complete, 15 to 20 minutes. This is not therapy, it's reconnaissance. You're going to identify 3 of your most durable behavioral patterns, the ones that feel compulsive and effective simultaneously, the ones you're quietly proud of yet slightly worried about at the exact same time. Then you're going to trace them back to the source code. Step 1, name the patterns honestly. Write down 3 behaviors that fit this description. I do this well. I do this more than I probably should. And some part of me knows it's not entirely clean. Don't write the sanitized LinkedIn version. Write the true one. Nobody's reading this but you. Step 2, find the first hit. For each pattern, locate the earliest memory of it working, of it producing a reward signal strong enough to encode into your architecture. Not a vague, "I've always been this way." I want a specific moment, a specific result, a specific feeling in your chest when the loop snapped shut. The age you find probably won't surprise you, but it might disturb you. Step 3, map the actual target. For each pattern, answer this: what is my brain actually being rewarded for when this works? Not the narrative you tell yourself. What is the dopamine system actually counting as a win? Is it creation or extraction? Sustainment or the spike? connection, or the confirmation of your own centrality in someone else's experience. Be specific. The architecture lives in the specifics. Step 4. Assess the design. Final question, and it's the only one that matters. Is this a reward function I would consciously choose if I were designing myself from scratch today? Not, is this behavior bad? That's the wrong altitude entirely. The question is whether the architecture is pointed at a target your current self would actually select. Whether the thing your brain has learned to call winning is the thing you right now sitting here today would call winning. If the answer is no, if you can see that the reward function was set in a valley you passed through years ago, optimized for a version of the world that doesn't even exist anymore, you've just done something genuinely difficult. You've identified the pattern underneath the pattern. That's where the actual work lives, not in the behavior, in what the behavior was built to serve. The building doesn't know what it's for. The 11-year-old sitting in that basement didn't know he was an architect. He thought he was just running a scam on some AOL suckers. That's the thing about cognitive architecture. It gets built in the margins, in the 48-hour caffeine-fueled sprints, in the dark rooms illuminated only by CRT monitors, in the specific moments when something resolves correctly, the signal fires, and you don't stop to ask what you're training yourself to love. Fluid intelligence gave me the capacity to build almost anything. It still does. The question it never once answered, the question it's constitutionally incapable of answering, is, what are you pointing this at, and what the fuck are you optimizing for? The valley between intermediate expertise and mastery is not a comfortable place to live. The ego rushes in to fill the space where crystallized wisdom hasn't arrived yet. The reward loops are already humming. The architecture is going up rapidly around whatever you happen to be pointing your attention at. And what makes you brilliant in that valley is the exact same thing that makes the architecture dangerous. You're far too good at it to notice you're laying the foundation for a room you might not be able to leave. Next edition, we go inside that room. What happens to a mind that has been architecturally optimized for the wrong target when it finally sees what's been built? Not in a neat flash of cinematic insight, but in the slow, expensive, and extremely inconvenient way that recognition actually arrives. The process isn't deconstruction, it's something stranger, harder, and vastly more interesting than tearing anything down. The builder doesn't demolish the building. The builder figures out which walls are load-bearing. You find the studs, you remap the blueprints, and eventually you realize the ultimate truth about the valley. You can stop haunting your own life. You are no longer being colonized by ghosts. You are the ghost, and ghosts don't have to answer to gravity. The Visage Entry 03 method. I'll give you the method and the madness. This was the method. Read every entry in order